Hello everybody, it's CVH here, and today we're going to be talking about even more card changes in the Elder Scrolls Legends. So for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, I did a video a couple weeks back about some previous card changes, but we've been hit with yet another patch. Today's the 24th of January, and I believe this goes into effect tomorrow, the 25th. We just found out about it late last night. So this is my first take on a video on it. I just want to go through the changes if you haven't heard them already, and give my thoughts on a few of them, how they might affect the metagame, how they might affect the popular decks that they're taking apart of, and how the metagame might progress moving forward, whether I think these are good changes for it or not. So if you haven't seen the changes, they're also accompanied by a ton of little patch notes, bug fixes, audio fixes, visual fixes, a bunch of quality of life stuff relating to the story and actual gameplay. I'll link that in the description below, so be sure to click the link and check it out if you haven't already. So without further ado, let's just get right into the first card changes. So the first change we have here is Ungolim the Listener. Now, I've been a little bit on the fence about Ungolim since I've started playing the game. On one hand, Ungolim in its currently form is easily the best one magic creature in the game, and it's also pretty easily the most ubiquitous agility card. Just about any deck you'll be seeing playing green on the ladder is going to be using Ungolim if the player owns an Ungolim. And he's kind of my spirit card, as you guys might know from my stream. I'm pretty good at drawing Ungolim on turn 1, and I'm pretty good about drawing the Brotherhood Assassins not too far after that. On the other hand, the things that make him upsetting, which are those Brotherhood Assassins coming down incredibly early, are also pretty reliant on the luck of the draw. Obviously, you have a 50-card deck minimum. Most people stick to 50, but 50-card minimum in Ranked, and 30-card in Arena. So obviously the card gets better in Arena, it's why it's usually just a stat pick in Arena. But in Constructed, especially the 50-card deck means, there's going to be those games when you play Ungolim turn 1, you're really happy to see him in your opening hand, you just never see the Brotherhood Assassins, and Ungolim basically turns into an enraged mud crab. So, while I was definitely in favor of a nerf to the card in my early days playing Legends, I've become more or less okay with him based on that alone. That said, leaving Ungolim alone seems to invariably sort of lead to this end result of Ungolim being included in every single deck using green until the end of time. Now, I'm pretty sure we could all live with that, but I think that was the problem they felt needed addressing here. Now, personally, I had always been assuming they'd actually nerf the Brotherhood Assassins themselves, and I had a few ideas of how they might do this. I think a reasonable nerf to them might have actually just been to making them 3/2s and making them fireboltable. We've seen that with a few cards. House Kinsman went from 3/3 to 3/2, Moonlight Werebat went from 4/3 to 4/2, and I think they were all very successful nerfs, because you're not really just talking about Firebolt there, you're talking about the fact that they just trade less efficiently. If you draw a 3/3 for on turn 2, if you draw one of those 3/3s, not only are you going to draw a card, replace itself, and give it lethal in case it survives, but it's very, very overwhelming to the board so early in the game. That being said, the change to making it a 1/1 might make a bit more difference than people are giving it credit for right now. For control decks and ramp decks like Ramp Scout, using this card, Ungolim's going to trade much less efficiently with a lot of early game creatures. And for aggressive decks, it's going to push half the damage of an enraged mud crab, which is a little disappointing to say the least. And that's a lot of the reason Brutal Ashlander actually doesn't see much play. So my gut feeling moving forward is that I still want to play Ungolim and everything that's using agility and take it in Arena all the time. So I don't think this nerf really changes much of my mindset, at least for starters, or where the card fits in my opinion. However, I do like what the nerf does to the card, and it feels more like you're making an investment in the future with your payment of 1 Magicka than simply playing a reasonable body for 1 Magicka with a huge upside and potential for just a blowout win condition, which is already still in the deck. You can still play a 1-drop 1/1 Ungolim and still draw those Brotherhood Assassins very early and win the game. So the next nerf we'll be talking about is the Dark Rift nerf. As you can see on screen, it's a 2-cost support, and it's going to be changing to a 3-cost support. And contrary to my initial thoughts on the Ungolim nerf, I think this one is fairly huge. Dark Rift has been a pretty defining card of the recent metagame, but unlike Ungolim, it hasn't always been this way. The card only really started to see widespread play a couple months ago, but it's been really widespread. If you look at, for example, at the Between the Lanes meta snapshot, if we assume the tier 1 to be something similar, such as midrange Sorcerer, Aggro Battle Mage, and Merrick Battle Mage, you notice a trend within all of these decks, and that trend is that almost every version of those decks generally are packing a full playset of Dark Rifts. Those of you who've been complaining that control decks have kind of gotten the short end of the stick recently should be quite happy with this change, because it's one of the most punishing cards in the game against control decks. Now, this card could still probably punish control decks as a 3-cost, even though there's that slightly greater chance and a slightly greater bit of time of giving your control deck opponent to draw their support removal to deal with the Dark Rift, but the Storm Atronachs are still pretty big and game defining. That's not exactly what I think the nerf does to the card. The issue with Dark Rift now as a 3-cost support, and kind of before to a 2-cost support to an extent, is that it's really anti-tempo. So you're using the Ring of Magicka to play it on turn 1 after your first player opponent decided to pass turn 1 with no turn 1 play, that's pretty acceptable. You're the first thing on the board, it's a Dark Rift, it's going to push some damage, and it's going to get a free 7/5 with ward eventually. But using a ring charge and sacrificing a turn 2 play, or worse yet, using your entire turn 3 to play a Dark Rift, seems pretty miserable against any aggressive deck. Maybe that's still reasonable against some control decks, but this is not a play I'd want to make against, let's just rattle off some decks, current aggro battle mage, Merrick battle mages, mid-range sorcerers, mid-range archers, mid-range scouts. There's a bunch of decks where I don't think you can sacrifice that much tempo early on. And while it can still be quite good against control when not punished by the support removal, even though they have that slight bit of more time to draw it now, you're now playing Dark Rift instead of playing a Young Mammoth or a Daggerfall Mage on turn 3, and those cards are also very good against control decks. So it did punish control, it still technically does, but for the Magicka cost you're paying for it, maybe other things just do the job better. It's just hard to justify 3 Magicka to me as a playable card, and my gut tells me that I don't want to play this card anymore, but I'm also not sure that I mind it being more or less removed from the metagame if that's what does come to pass. There are other ways to punish control decks, like I said, just curving out is one way, and it really was absurdly good when drawn early against those control decks, especially those without support removal. So it might open up the meta a bit, let those control decks feel like there are less games they lose from the start, and might make your, especially control mage in those decks that don't have support removal in the class, it might make them feel less bad about queuing games on the ladder, where they're not playing the support removal, knowing that they're going to be walking into, for example, in this metagame, the 3 tier 1 decks all packing a playset of Dark Rift, it felt pretty bad to queue a deck without support removal that was going to the late game, so maybe this helps that situation somewhat. Gladiator Arena is the next card on our list, and it takes a pretty straightforward nerf from 3 cost to 4 cost. This is one that I think people are saying it's going to nerf aggro battle mage very hard. Obviously I mentioned that as one of my sort of problem decks that people were thinking that needed to be nerfed at the beginning of this video, but I really don't think this nerf does too much for the deck. I think it's a fair nerf. I think it's a, like Dark Rift, we have the same sort of problem where it's sort of an upsetting card if you're not playing a deck that has like inherent support removal in the class, and it's one of those cards that certain decks just don't have an answer to. On turn 3 it can come out very early, start deciding the games, and it contributes more to the actual problem that people have with Prophecy Battle Mage, which isn't so much that it's a good aggressive strategy, obviously we're going to have those forever, but it's sort of that it uses the Prophecy mechanic to its advantage, and the Prophecy mechanic is supposed to be this thing that allows, slower decks to be defensive against faster strategies. But here we have the fastest deck currently in the metagame, breaking its own runes, running a ton of prophecies, and just, pounding your opponents with Fate Weavers and free cast outs because of Gladiator's Arena, and to a lesser extent Afflicted Elite. But Gladiator's Arena in the long term can just, set it up early, and you're going to be drawing a couple cards from your runes. It's unlikely that your opponent's going to be able to race you to make the card less good. So they've simply made it more expensive, and if a card is in aggro and it's made more expensive, that's typically a pretty good nerf to it. However, I think still that this card is playable in exactly aggro battle mage because it has so many prophecies. I don't think we're going to see less of this card. I just think it makes it more of a fair play. Again, like Ungolim, for your Magicka, you're paying more of an investment. It's a very important effect for that deck, and I think another thing this nerf to this card does is make it less viable in other aggro decks that don't necessarily pack a bunch of prophecies in there. So we might see a lot more of those aggro decks come to the forefront now that Gladiator's Arena is a little bit less efficient, and of course with Battle Mage, Dark Rift is less efficient as well, so you might see more decks like Crusader pop up, and I think that opens up a lot of room in the metagame. I'm glad this nerf happened. But for a lot of the times you're going to play Gladiator Arena, even now as a 3 cost, it happens a little bit later in the game, so a lot of the times I was personally playing it, I was floating a Magicka or 2 anyway, so chances are you're still going to be playing it in certain decks like Aggro Battle Mage as a 4 cost. If you're playing it as a 3 cost, shouldn't change much of the functionality of the card in my opinion. And a lot of that's because Gladiator Arena really isn't like an on-curve play in a lot of these matchups. It's safer to just play your creatures first and use Arena to burn your opponent out and refill your hand later, and I think that's where Gladiator Arena still sort of fits in. Now we're getting to the big nerfs, guys. Blackworm Necromancer, which you can see on screen, been a critical part of the mid-range Sorcerer deck and mid-range Scout decks and other decks for a while now, in much the same way Soul Rest Marshal was an integral part of the mid-range Archer decks when it costs 5 in virtually every list. Blackworm Necromancer is now taking the Soul Rest Marshal hit. That card was increased to 6 Magicka in a recent patch, and now Blackworm Necromancer also increased to 6 Magicka. The rest of the card, however, is staying exactly the same. Soul Rest Marshal got a slight buff when it was increased to 6, in that it could again reduce things by 6. Blackworm Necromancer is still going to have the same stats and the same effect. So, I talked a little bit about the Ring of Magicka in a previous video, and I thought these curve-based strategies that obviously Soul Rest and Blackworm Necromancer embody might be hit more by a nerf to the ring. They went the other way, they decided to nerf the actual cards themselves. And they didn't nerf the support cards to sorcerers such as maybe Young Mammoth or Daggerfall Mage. Those were 2 that I was thinking about. that I think I might have mentioned in the previous video as well. They went straight for the big guy, Black Room Necromancer, and I don't mind this, obviously, because Black Room Necromancer, Soul Rest, Marshal, Triumph, and Jarl, these are all cards that if they're slightly out of balance, it feels really bad to lose to them. Just get ahead in life for one little turn by one little point, and all of a sudden this crazy swing turn is going to happen to you. So Black Room Necromancer, though, I don't know if this is exactly the nerf I would have tried first. Maybe they did try a stat nerf and they decided it wasn't quite worth it, or it wasn't quite good enough, rather. But I think I would have been okay with a stat nerf to this card. It would have reduced the swinginess of the turn anyway, making it like a 4-3 or a 4-2, but still on turn 5. If you're playing a 4-2 on turn 5 that gets back a 4 from the discard, it's obviously worse than playing a 4-4 that gets back another 4-4 on turn 5. They just simply increase the cost to 6, and I think at that point it gets quite slow. I'm not exactly sure about this card anymore. You probably still play it in the same mid-range sorcerer decks that I was in, just because it's probably the best thing you can do on turn 6. But I'm not sure if I'll be, screaming about it, writing home about it. I definitely don't think I'll be complaining about it anymore. I think this nerf does more to this card than it did to Soul Rest Marshal, because Soul Rest you have control over what you get. Black Room Necromancer was already sort of controlled by RNG to a degree. Obviously, it benefited from the fact that these sorcerer decks just played the best creature they possibly could on curve, so even if you were getting a 2-drop, it was going to be a Windkeep Spell Sword or something like that. Young Mammoth was obviously a fantastic 3-drop to get back, so there was a lot of value there. But on turn 6, getting back one of those cards, that's obviously just worse than turn 5. So I'm not exactly sure how good this card is anymore, but it was quite good before. And there were definitely a lot of opportunities, a lot of different options based on how to nerf this card. And while I think I would have liked to see a stat nerf, like I mentioned, this card definitely reduces ineffectiveness enough to where I think we probably won't be complaining about mid-range sorcerer dominating the ladder as completely as it has been for much longer. The final nerf to talk about in this video is Shrieking Harpy. You can see it on screen. 2-drop, 2/2, Prophecy Summon, Shackle an enemy creature. This card has seen a ton of play since virtually the beginning of time. It's kind of a snap 3 of in almost every single blue deck, much as Ungolim was a snap 1 of in every single green deck. And the nerf to it, I think, I'm not going to be talking about it too much because I don't think it changes much. It just makes it a 2-1 instead of a 2-2. So I do think this is a good nerf. I think it's a fair nerf. I think the card was slightly out of balance. And I think the card is a lot more imbalanced now. It really has no business trading favorably with things like Thieves Guild recruits. That's sort of just icing on the cake. But because it's sort of just icing on the cake, I think the nerf, while it's going to make it more fair as a 2-1, doesn't really change the fact that I want to play 3 of this card in virtually everything that runs intelligence, maybe even until the end of time. It's still a fantastic prophecy, takes a lot of damage off the board, and it's still going to trade with, on your turn, the same things that it was going to before. It's still going to deal that 2 damage to whatever 2 health aggro creature you need to clear after you've shackled something as a prophecy. So the core of this card remains intact, it just seems slightly more imbalanced now. Now, it wouldn't be a patch without some buffs, unless of course it was the last patch, but today we have a couple to talk about, and the first is Gladiator Mystic, as we can see on the screen. A card I've never been fully able to pronounce, but it's a 5-drop 4/4 with Pilfer, draw a random support from your deck. This is a card I haven't really seen anyone really play except in the Altar Monk decks, and even there, it's been taken out a lot of the time. And a lot of the reason that is because when you're mentioning staples in blue, like we just were, you have to mention Lightning Bolt. And the rules are pretty simple, they go a little bit like this. If you're going to play a creature that costs more than Lightning Bolt, and it dies immediately to 1 Lightning Bolt, it's gotta get a ton of value immediately. It's gotta be like Supreme Necromancer or Shadowfen Priest. Gladiator Mystic, it costs more than Lightning Bolt, it dies to a single Lightning Bolt, and in order to get value from it, it has to live a turn, and it has to attack your opponent directly. So that's a lot of things that need to go right just to draw random support, and it's never been totally worth it. As a 4/5, I don't think it'll still be worth it in many decks, but in certain decks like the Altar Monk, it might be viable just for the fact that, hey, now it doesn't die to Lightning Bolt. Now maybe some opponents have to use a Piercing Javelin or Edict of Reserva. And if you're basing your entire strategy around a powerful support like Altar Monk is, I think you could probably justify the still pretty hefty cost for the card and still having to wait a turn to get the value, because the value is very important to your style of deck. So I don't think this makes the card insane or anything, but I think it actually makes it playable, and that's a good thing. So this last buff that we're going to talk about is Reeve Blademaster, and this is one that I've seen suggested countless times, and this is one of those occasions where the buff that's been suggested countless times is actually the one that Bethesda and Direwolf decided to go with. So Reeve was a 2/5, and now it's a 3/5, because they said they didn't want it to get executed so much. It just felt bad playing the 4-drop legendary, unique legendary at that. That just got legendary, that just got executed on summon rather, and just couldn't get its effect in whenever. So as a 3/5, I actually think this card is very strong. Now, as a 2/5, I was even trying it in Aggro Battle Mage still, and yeah, it didn't really trade too well, it got executed a couple times, but it was still pretty reasonable at pushing damage. As a 3/5, it trades that much better, it doesn't get killed for free as often. A lot of the issue with Reeve as a 2/5 was that your opponent could just trade their creatures into it, like 2 of them at a time, and Reeve with its puny little 2 attack couldn't really take anything down with it. Now, it's harder to get rid of, it pushes more damage on its first attack, and as, I guess, the upside that we all wanted, it doesn't get executed for 1 magicka as soon as you play it. So Reeve, I think now, I might be judging this card a little bit preemptively, but I think this might be the kind of card that I want to try in virtually everything that plays red at the moment. I think if you're playing Archer and you're trying to get ahead on life, Reeve is a 3/5, it's dealing damage to face as soon as you start attacking with it. I think that's a pretty good card for the strategy. I think it might fit into aggro decks now that they've gotten a little bit slower and might be looking for more options. Aggro Battle Mage, I think, probably just wants the card, but obviously this is a little bit without testing. I haven't gotten a chance to play with any of these changes yet, as you can see on screen. The cards are still in their current form, so I'm excited to test Reeve, and I think that was the point of the buff. I think we now have found one more legendary in the game that's playable and you don't feel like disenchanting as soon as you pull. So those are all the changes. I'm pretty excited to go out and test them. Hopefully you guys are too. I think they're very positive changes. I usually think that when a patch first hits though, and I haven't been disappointed so far. So I think this introduces a lot of changes that are relevant to the current metagame. If we think again about the tier 1 of decks, which are generally considered to be, again, mid-range Sorcerer, Aggro Battle Mage, Merrick Battle Mage, we definitely see some hits to Aggro Battle Mage, we definitely see some hits to mid-range Sorcerer, and I bring Supreme Necromancer to the screen just because I'd like to close by talking about a couple cards that weren't touched that I think maybe, well, you know, in my mind they should have been, but again, I'm not a developer, I don't have access to these testing resources that they do by testing new metas in advance. Supreme Necromancer is a card that still kind of scares me. I mentioned it a couple of weeks back, I think, in a video about potential changes I'd like to see. Check that video out if you haven't already. But Supreme Necromancer is a pretty bursty card. It's used to the greatest extent in the Merrick Battle Mage decks, and if you look at the nerfs, they really don't touch the deck too much. They nerf Streaking Harpy a bit. Like I mentioned, I don't think that nerf affects the card's playability really at all. And of course they touch Dark Rift, which is a 3-of in most versions of the deck, but it's also a 3-of in a lot of other decks as well, so I think it's more of like a nerf amongst all decks. I don't really think they touched Merrick Battle Mage much by itself, and I think a lot of the implications of these nerfs to aggro decks are going to be, and the tempo and mid-range decks like Black Room Necromancer as well, I think a lot of the implications of that control decks get better, and I think Merrick Battle Mage gets better positioned as a result. Supreme Necromancer is one card that I personally have my eye on of whether or not it's still too powerful. I also think Daggerfall Mage is one that might be up for consideration in the future. I suppose they want to stay away from nerfing legendaries as much as possible because, you know, they're high-impact cards that we all feel cool about pulling, we all want to craft them, we all want to use them to good extent. But I think Supreme Necromancer, Daggerfall Mage, maybe Young Mammoth if Sorcerer still remains out of hand a little bit, which I don't think it will, but that's one of the cards I was considering before. These are all things that they might be looking at in the future, and I'd like to hear your opinions on them as well. Are there things that you think should have been nerfed that weren't touched? Are there things that should have been buffed that you really want to see buffed that weren't buffed? Obviously, they buff a lot less cards than they nerf usually. But what do you think about these nerfs? Do you think they're positive as I do? Do you think the meta might be well positioned? Do you think any decks threaten to be at the top of the metagame and uncontested in power level? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, or if you're reading this on Reddit or watching this on Reddit, you know, leave a comment there. I'd love to read them. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more strategy videos, deck techs, highlights, other things. Follow the stream in the description below. I already mentioned I'll link the patch notes in case you haven't read all of those, so I do encourage you to do so, and I will see you guys next time.